The Princess Dilemma. Princess Zoreth sat in her grand chamber, her eyes staring out of the enormous window at the stars beyond. Her kingdom, a beautiful alien world, was at the peak of its power. Her people had lived in peace for centuries, with technology far beyond that of any human race. Yet today, she felt more fear than pride. Her father, King Veldar, had called for her, and she had answered as always. But this time, it was different. This time, the king was not speaking about treaties or alliances, or the peaceful expansion of their territory. No, this time, the king had spoken of marriage. Zoreth, King Veldar's voice was firm but filled with authority. You must marry the human leader, Captain Ryan. Her heart sank. She had heard of him, of course. Every alien in the galaxy had. Captain Ryan, the ruthless warlord. His name was spoken with fear across the galaxy. He was known for leading his forces with cold efficiency, showing no mercy to his enemies. He had crushed civilizations and brought entire worlds to their knees. And now he was the one her father expected her to marry. Zoreth tried to hide her disgust, but it was impossible. The idea of marrying such a monster filled her with dread. She knew her father's reasons. The human race had become more powerful over the last few decades, and the treaty they were about to sign with humanity was the key to keeping her kingdom safe. The humans had demanded this marriage, and her father had agreed without hesitation. But how could she marry a man like him? A man who had killed without mercy, who had never shown any compassion for those weaker than himself. The thought made her stomach turn. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The words were heavy, like stones in her mouth. But father, how can you ask me to marry him? I've heard the stories. His cruelty, his bloodlust. I cannot be with someone like that. King Veldar looked at her, his expression hard and unreadable. Zoreth, this is not about love. This is about survival. You are the key to securing the future of our people. The humans will help us defend ourselves from the Thrak aliens, who are becoming more dangerous by the day. If you marry Ryan, we will have the support we need to protect our kingdom. Zoreth felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. Her duty to her people was clear. She had always known that one day she would have to marry for the sake of the kingdom. But never like this. Never to a man whose name made her blood run cold. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain strong. Then we risk everything. War. Destruction. Your refusal could lead to the downfall of everything we have worked for. Her father's words were a cold, hard truth. The humans were too powerful now. If she refused, the war that would follow would be unlike anything they had ever seen. Zoreth knew that, as well as anyone. But still, the thought of marrying someone like Captain Ryan terrified her. That night, Zoreth couldn't sleep. She paced the cold stone floors of her chamber, her mind racing. She had been trained for diplomacy, for leadership, for making difficult decisions. But this was too much. How could she marry a man who had no mercy for anyone? How could she marry a killer? Her thoughts turned to her mother, who had died when she was young. Her mother had been kind and wise, a gentle ruler who had always put her people first. Zoreth remembered how she had spoken of love and honor, how she had always believed that a ruler's heart should be in harmony with their people. But what was she supposed to do when love had no place in the decision? When it was all about power, politics, and survival? Tears welled up in her eyes. Her mother would never have asked her to do this. But then again, her mother had never faced the threat of the Thrak aliens. Her mother had never been forced to choose between the future of their people and her own happiness. Zoreth wiped her eyes angrily. She couldn't cry. She couldn't let her fear control her. She was the princess. She was strong. She had to be. But still, the thought of meeting Captain Ryan filled her with dread. The stories she had heard, of his brutal victories, of the way he showed no mercy to his enemies, haunted her. The humans had painted him as a hero, but Zoreth saw only a monster. His cold eyes, his icy demeanor, they sent chills down her spine. But what if the stories weren't true? What if the man she was about to meet was different from the monster everyone spoke of? What if her fears were nothing more than lies? Zoreth felt conflicted. She couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her chest. Yet, part of her wondered if she was being unfair, if she was letting rumors and hearsay cloud her judgment. She would have to meet him. She would have to see him for herself. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind filled with uncertainty, Zoreth made a decision. She would go to the human colony herself. She would meet Captain Ryan face to face. She would find out if he was the monster the stories made him out to be, or if he was someone entirely different. Tomorrow, everything would change. The human's reputation. Zoreth's mind was heavy as she prepared to leave the comfort of her home. She knew she was stepping into the unknown, about to face a man whose very name struck fear in the hearts of even the bravest of her people. She had heard the rumors, the stories that painted Captain Ryan as a monster, a ruthless destroyer of worlds. They said he had single-handedly wiped out entire colonies, his eyes cold as ice, his hands drenched in the blood of countless enemies. Yet, despite the terror she felt, Zoreth couldn't help but wonder. Were the stories true? Was he really as evil as everyone claimed, or had his reputation been twisted by the fear of those who dared not oppose him? The long journey to the human colony was a blur of emotions. Zoreth could feel her heart racing as her ship cut through the blackness of space, heading toward the human world. The thought of meeting Ryan in person seemed impossible to wrap her mind around. What would he be like? Would he look like the stories? Tall, menacing, with eyes that could pierce through her very soul? Or was there more to him than the brutal image painted by her people? Her father had given her a piece of advice before she left. Zoreth, he had said, you must remember this is not about who he is. This is about our future. Stay focused. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. His words echoed in her mind now, but they brought little comfort. She had always trusted her instincts, but now she had to silence them and focus on her duty. The closer the ship got to the human colony, the more her fear grew. She had never been this close to a human world before. The humans were strange, unpredictable, their ways so different from those of her own people. And yet, they were now the key to the survival of her kingdom. The ship finally broke through the atmosphere of the human planet, its metal hull groaning as it entered the airspace. Zoreth took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. It was time. As she walked down the ramp from her ship and set foot on the human soil, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that could determine the fate of her entire species. She was led to the meeting hall, a grand structure of human design, built with sharp angles and towering walls. The place was filled with human soldiers, all standing at attention, their eyes trained on her. Zoreth was used to being a princess, but there was something different here. The humans didn't look at her with the same reverence her people did. They looked at her with curiosity, even suspicion. At the front of the room stood Captain Ryan. He was tall, his posture commanding, and his eyes. They were not the cold, dead eyes she had expected. They were sharp, calculating, but not unfeeling. In fact, there was something oddly familiar in them, as if they saw through her, and yet there was no malice. He was dressed in military gear, his uniform dark and fitted, the insignia of his rank proudly displayed on his chest. He had a certain presence about him, not just from his size or appearance, but from the way he carried himself. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't fear. It was something Zoreth couldn't place, something she hadn't expected. He looked like a man who had seen war, who had fought and bled, but there was no sign of the monster she had heard about. When he spoke, his voice was deep, yet not harsh. It wasn't the voice of a tyrant. "Princess Zoreth," he said, his tone even, almost respectful. "I trust your journey was comfortable." Zoreth's breath caught in her throat. The stories had never mentioned a human leader who spoke with such calmness, such control. It was a shock to her, the way his voice didn't carry any of the venom she had been prepared for. She had expected someone who would belittle her, who would intimidate her into submission. But instead, Here stood a man who treated her as an equal. Yes, Zorath stammered, caught off guard by the kindness in his voice. She forced herself to regain composure. I didn't expect to find you so different from the stories. Captain Ryan raised an eyebrow. And what stories would those be, Princess? Zorath hesitated. The stories she had heard were not kind, not by any stretch of the imagination. But something in her gut told her she had to ask, to understand who this man truly was. The tales of your past, she said carefully. The wars you fought. The merciless way you've led your people. I've heard you've destroyed entire worlds. Ryan's expression remained unchanged, though his eyes darkened ever so slightly. War has a way of changing a man, Princess. Sometimes we do things because we must. I've done what needed to be done to keep my people safe, and I have no regrets for the decisions I've made. But I am not what the stories say. I'm not a monster. Zorath stared at him, her heart beating in her chest. She had expected a man who would embrace the violence of his reputation, someone who would boast about his conquests. Instead, here was someone who seemed burdened by it. Why do you think the stories exist, then? Zorath asked. She could feel herself softening, but she kept her guard up. Why do they say you're cruel? Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the soldiers behind him, then back to her. Because sometimes people see what they want to see. They need someone to blame for the chaos in the universe. My people, we were forced to fight. We didn't have a choice. And in the end, we all wear the scars of that fight, some more than others. Zorath could feel the weight of his words. There was truth in them, a truth she hadn't expected. Her people had always seen the humans as the enemy, the aggressors, but Ryan's words made her question everything she had believed. She still wasn't sure what to think of him. Was he truly the man she had heard about? Or was there more to him, a side that had never been shown to her people? One thing was certain. The more she saw of Captain Ryan, the more she realized she would need to know the truth for herself. And that truth, she feared, might change everything. First encounter. Zorath could feel her pulse quicken as she followed Captain Ryan down the narrow hallways of the human base. The walls were lined with strange technology, blinking lights and holograms that seemed to hum with energy. The air was thick with the scent of metal and machinery, a world so different from her own home. She kept her gaze ahead, unwilling to let herself be distracted by the strange new world around her. Her mission was clear. She had to understand who Ryan really was. And the only way to do that was to spend time with him. To see him not as the cold, ruthless warlord of the rumors, but as the man he claimed to be. Ryan had led her into what appeared to be his personal quarters, a space filled with the stark, utilitarian decor of a military leader. There were no personal touches, no signs of luxury, only clean lines and practical furnishings. But what struck Zorath most was the quiet. The silence in the room was almost deafening, as if it held the weight of countless unspoken words. Ryan stood by a table, silently pouring 2 cups of a strange liquid into mugs. "Tea," he said, his voice still calm. "I assume you've had it before." Zorath nodded stiffly, though she was far more focused on the man before her than the drink in his hands. She could feel his eyes on her, and it made her uneasy. Not in the way she had expected, though. It wasn't the cold, calculating stare of a predator sizing up its prey. No, it was something different, something that felt almost curious. "Why have you been so kind to me?" Zorath asked, surprising herself with the question. "You don't have to pretend to be respectful. You could just take what you want. Your people are powerful, after all." Ryan paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the mugs. Then he placed them on the table with care, his movements deliberate. He met her eyes, his expression serious, but not threatening. "I'm not pretending," he said quietly. "There's no need for games here, Princess. I understand why you're here, and I understand what's expected of me. But that doesn't mean I have to treat you like an object or a tool to be used. I don't believe in that kind of power. I never have. Zorath's eyes widened slightly. The words felt heavy, weighted with sincerity. For a moment, she almost believed him. She had heard that humans were capable of deep emotions, but she had never expected to see it in a man like Ryan. A man who had been cast as a monster, a machine of war. Why not? Zorath couldn't help but ask. You could have used me as a pawn, like your people expect you to. You could have intimidated me, crushed me with your power. So why do this? Why show me kindness? Ryan sighed and leaned back against the table, his gaze distant for a moment as though considering the question carefully. Because, Princess, he said, his voice low and thoughtful, I've seen enough of that kind of power. The kind that destroys everything in its path. I've led wars, fought battles that I'd rather forget. But in the end, the thing I've learned is this. True strength doesn't come from crushing others. It comes from knowing when to stand tall and when to show compassion, when to fight for what matters, and when to protect the people who rely on you. Zorath stared at him, her mind racing. This was not the man she had been prepared to meet. The man she had expected would be boastful, arrogant, and brimming with self-importance. Instead, this was a man who seemed tired. A man who had seen too much and learned painful lessons along the way. It made her question everything she had believed about the humans, and about Ryan himself. She took a cautious step forward, her curiosity growing. You've been through so much, haven't you? All these wars, these battles. What did it cost you? What have you lost? Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to a small window that overlooked the base's landing pad. Zorath could see ships taking off and landing, soldiers marching below. The sounds of the base filled the room, but for a moment, everything felt distant, as if time itself had slowed. It cost me everything, Ryan finally said, his voice rough with emotion. I've lost comrades, friends, parts of myself that I can never get back. I did what I had to do to survive, to keep my people alive. But survival isn't the same as living. There are days when I wake up and wonder if all the blood spilled was worth it. If any of it was worth it. Zorath felt a knot form in her throat as she listened to him. She could see the weight of his words, the sorrow buried beneath them. This was not the man she had been led to fear. This was a man who had fought, who had blood, who had been forced into choices no one should have to make. And now, standing in front of her, he was showing her a side of him she never expected to see. A side filled with regret and quiet pain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Zorath felt as if the world around them had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in the stillness. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Zorath broke the quiet. I don't know what to think of you, she admitted softly. The stories, they make you sound like a monster. But now, I see something else. I see a man who has lost so much, who has been forced into a life he never chose. Ryan turned to look at her, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. I am what I've had to be, he said simply. But that doesn't mean I have to be that forever. We all have a choice, and I choose to show you who I really am, not the monster you've been told about. Zorath felt her heart race. She didn't know what to say. The man standing before her was nothing like the stories. He was human, in every sense of the word. Vulnerable, broken, yet somehow stronger for it. And for the first time since meeting him, Zorath wasn't afraid. She didn't know what her future held, but in that moment, she realized that Captain Ryan might not be the enemy she had always been taught to fear. Maybe, just maybe, he was something far more complex than the monster the galaxy had painted him to be. And that thought, terrifying as it was, opened a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. Doubts and realizations. The days that followed were filled with tension, yet there was a strange, unspoken connection growing between Zorath and Ryan. They spent more time together, speaking about the past, about the wars, about the choices they had been forced to make. But it wasn't just the past they talked about. It was the present, too. Ryan shared his hopes for his people, his vision for a future where they no longer had to fight for survival. Zoreth found herself listening more than speaking, captivated by his quiet determination. The princess had come to this human world with one goal: to understand if the man she was about to marry was truly the ruthless monster her people had warned her about. But every conversation, every moment spent with him, made her question everything she thought she knew about humanity and herself. She still had her doubts. She still couldn't shake the fear that Ryan was playing some kind of game, that he was hiding his true nature behind a mask of kindness. The whispers of his brutality, his unyielding thirst for conquest, still echoed in her mind. But every time she looked into his eyes, she saw something different, something deeper: compassion, regret, and perhaps even a hint of fear. It was on the 4th day of her stay that Zoreth was given a chance to see Ryan in action. The base had been alerted to a potential threat, a rogue faction of human rebels, desperate and dangerous. Ryan's eyes had narrowed when the alert came in, his calm demeanor shifting to a focused intensity. Zoreth had been invited to watch the defense strategy unfold, and though she had no intention of staying passive, she knew she had to witness what the man she was about to marry was truly capable of. She watched as Ryan moved through the base's command center, barking orders with precision, his voice steady and commanding. His soldiers listened to him without question, their respect for him clear. They weren't afraid of him, not like she had imagined. There was a loyalty there, an understanding, that made Zoreth pause. Ryan didn't just lead with strength. He led with a sense of responsibility, as if every life under his command mattered. She had seen leaders before, warriors who ruled with fear, demanding obedience through punishment and cruelty. But Ryan was different. He didn't demand respect. He earned it. The tension in the air thickened as the threat drew closer, and Zoreth couldn't help but notice how Ryan's eyes hardened with the weight of the decision that loomed ahead. This wasn't just a mission to him. This was his people's safety, their survival, once again on the line. Zoreth had heard of humans being brutal in battle, merciless in the face of their enemies. But as she watched Ryan prepare, she saw something else, something that made her heart ache. Ryan didn't want to fight. He didn't want to kill. But he was willing to, if it meant protecting those he cared about. Zoreth followed him as he led his team to the front lines, her mind racing with thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to entertain before. If this man was as ruthless as the stories made him out to be, he would have crushed these rebels without hesitation. But instead, he spoke to them first, offering them a chance to surrender. His words weren't laced with anger or malice. They were calm, measured, as if he were trying to reach out to the rebels, to remind them of the humanity they shared. It was then that the full truth hit Zoreth. She had come to this place with preconceived notions about what it meant to be strong, to be a leader. She had been taught that power was something to be wielded with force, that cruelty could bring about peace. But Ryan was showing her a different kind of power. A power born from understanding, from compassion, from the willingness to choose a different path, even when that path was the hardest. The battle that followed was fierce, but it wasn't a bloodbath. Ryan's team fought with precision, with care. They incapacitated the rebels without taking unnecessary lives. Zoreth had never seen anything like it. The humans she had been taught to fear didn't fight to destroy. They fought to protect, to preserve life. As the rebels were subdued and brought into custody, Zoreth felt a sense of awe she couldn't ignore. She had expected to witness carnage, to see Ryan revel in the destruction he could cause. But instead, she had seen a leader who fought not out of desire for conquest, but out of necessity, to safeguard his people. After the battle, Zoreth found herself standing beside Ryan, her thoughts swirling in confusion. She had seen him in the heat of battle, had seen him make choices that were guided by a moral compass, not by the thirst for power. The man who had been painted as a monster was, in fact, a man who understood the cost of war, the weight of leadership, and the value of mercy. I thought you would kill them, Zoreth said quietly, her voice almost a whisper as she watched the rebels being taken away. Ryan gave her a look that was at once soft and hard, the weight of his past heavy in his eyes. I've done enough killing in my life, Princess, he said. I don't want to do any more if I don't have to. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from fighting, but from knowing when to stop. Zoreth's heart pounded in her chest as she processed his words. In that moment, she realized the truth. Ryan wasn't the man she had been told about. He wasn't the monster. He was someone different entirely. Someone who had been forged in the fires of war, but who still believed in the possibility of peace. Her doubts, once so certain, now felt like distant echoes. She had come to this place with fear in her heart, but now she was beginning to understand that fear had no place here. The man she had been sent to marry wasn't a monster. He was a man who had seen the worst of the universe and chosen to fight for something better. And as the sun set over the base, casting long shadows over the land, Zoreth couldn't help but wonder, was this the future she had been so afraid of? Or was this the beginning of something she had never imagined? A chance for a different kind of alliance, built not on fear, but on understanding. Unexpected connection. The days that followed the battle with the rebels brought a strange calm over the base. The tension from the skirmish had died down, but Zoreth couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She had come here expecting to marry a monster, someone who would strike fear into her heart. But instead, she found herself questioning everything she had ever known about strength, power, and the humans who were supposed to be her enemies. Zoreth found herself spending more time with Ryan, something that had never been part of her plan. But after witnessing his restraint and leadership firsthand, she couldn't bring herself to stay away. Every conversation with him seemed to unravel more of the mystery she had built up in her mind. There was something about him, something that was so different from the ruthless killer she had imagined. He had a way of speaking that made her feel like her thoughts were being heard, not dismissed. His eyes weren't just cold, as the stories had claimed, but filled with a quiet warmth that caught her off guard. Today, as she walked through the base's training facility, she found herself drawn to the sight of Ryan sparring with a group of his soldiers. It was strange, seeing him in the midst of a fight. He wasn't the merciless beast the stories painted him as. There was a grace to his movements, a fluidity that suggested years of training and discipline. His soldiers were just as skilled, but there was something different about the way Ryan moved. He wasn't just fighting, he was teaching. Zoreth watched from a distance, observing how he carefully corrected their stances, offering words of encouragement when they succeeded, and constructive criticism when they faltered. It was a kind of leadership Zoreth had never seen before. He wasn't commanding his soldiers with fear or intimidation. He was leading them with respect, with patience. After the sparring session, Ryan approached her, his expression unreadable as usual, but there was a small glimmer of something in his eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice still steady but with an edge of curiosity. "What brings you to the training grounds?" Zoreth hesitated. "I wanted to see you, in your element," she said, the words sounding strange as they left her lips. But it was the truth. She had seen him lead in battle, but seeing him in this setting, teaching, guiding, helping others become better, was something that opened her eyes in ways she hadn't expected. Ryan nodded, taking a step closer. "This is where the real work happens. The battles may be fought with weapons, but true strength comes from the mind and the heart. If you don't have the discipline to control your instincts, you'll lose more than the fight. You'll lose yourself." Zoreth looked at him, her mind racing. She had seen his strength in battle, his compassion during the rebellion. But now, in this quiet moment, she saw the depth of his wisdom. It wasn't just about power or leadership. It was about understanding, about control, about knowing the difference between when to strike and when to hold back. "You speak as though you know this from experience," Zoreth said, her voice barely a whisper. There was something about him, something that felt almost haunted. She had never known a leader who spoke like this with such conviction. It was as if Ryan had lived through battles not just with his enemies, but within himself. Ryan's gaze softened for a moment, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I've had to learn the hard way," he said quietly. "When you've been through enough wars, when you've seen enough destruction, you start to realize that the hardest fight is the one within. The fight to stay human, to hold on to the parts of you that make you more than just a weapon." Zoreth felt her chest tighten. She had thought that Ryan was a man hardened by war, someone who had given up on any notion of peace or compassion. But now, hearing his words, she wondered if she had misunderstood everything. The stories told of a man who had destroyed without mercy, a man who was only concerned with victory. But here, in front of her, was a man who had suffered, who had been broken by war, and who was still struggling to find a way to hold on to his humanity. She realized, in that moment, that she had been wrong about him. Ryan wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been shaped by the very wars he had fought, but who still clung to the hope that there was a way out of the cycle of violence. As they stood there in the quiet training room, Zoreth's mind spun with the realization that everything she had been told about the humans, about Ryan, had been based on fear, not truth. She had come to this place thinking she would be forced to marry a man who would rule with cruelty, who would drag her into a life of violence and bloodshed. But now, she was starting to see that Ryan was not the man she had imagined. He was someone who had fought to protect his people, who had learned from his mistakes, and who was willing to do what was necessary to build something better, even if that meant confronting the darkest parts of himself. For the first time, Zoreth began to wonder if she could be a part of that future. Could she stand beside him, not as a pawn in a political game, but as an equal? Could she help him build the future he dreamed of? One where strength wasn't defined by destruction, but by the ability to protect and preserve. Her heart raced with the thought. She had come to this planet expecting to find fear, hatred, and bloodshed. But what she found instead was something far more complicated. She had found a man who was struggling to be more than the monster everyone believed him to be. And she couldn't help but wonder, could she be the one to help him find that peace? Zoreth knew it wasn't going to be easy. There were still so many questions to answer, so many obstacles to overcome. But as she looked at Ryan, standing there in the quiet aftermath of the training session, she felt something shift deep within her. There was a connection between them, a bond forged not by fate or duty, but by the understanding that both of them were more than the stories told about them. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something worth fighting for. The moment of truth. Zoreth woke early the next morning, her mind tangled with thoughts she hadn't been able to shake since the previous night. The quiet moments shared with Ryan had left her unsettled in a way she couldn't explain. She had come to the human colony expecting to find a man who would be a cold, distant stranger, someone whose cruelty would mirror the stories she had been told. But with each passing day, the more she saw of him, the more she realized that she had been wrong. Ryan was not the monster she had feared. He was a man shaped by war, yes, but he was also a man of depth, a man who had been scared by his past, but was fighting to become something more. Zoreth had seen glimpses of his humanity in the way he treated his soldiers, in the way he spoke about leadership, and even in the quiet moments when he thought no one was watching. And now, as she stood on the precipice of the life that awaited her, a life of duty and obligation, she was forced to confront the truth that had been hiding in her heart. Could she marry him? Could she be with someone who had fought as hard as he had, someone who carried the weight of so many lives on his shoulders? The answer wasn't clear. Zoreth had spent her entire life being prepared for this moment, for the moment when she would have to marry for the good of her kingdom, to unite two worlds in a time of crisis. But now that the moment had arrived, the choice was no longer as simple as she had once believed. She had been raised to believe that duty came first, that personal desires were secondary to the greater good. But her heart told her something different. Her heart was telling her that the future she had always imagined, the future her father had expected her to embrace, was no longer enough. She had to make a choice, one that would change everything. That afternoon, Zoreth requested a private audience with her father. She had never been nervous around him before, but today was different. Today, she was about to ask for something that could jeopardize the very future of her kingdom. But it wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about her own future, her own heart, and the choices she would make going forward. The king's chambers were grand and imposing, as they always were, with walls lined in gold and intricate tapestries depicting the kingdom's history. King Velder sat behind a massive desk, his face unreadable as Zoreth entered the room. She had always admired her father's strength, his ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation. But today, she knew she would have to challenge him. "Father," Zoreth began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I need to speak with you about the marriage." Her father's gaze sharpened, his expression guarded. "What about it?" he asked, his voice cold, as if prepared for a conflict. "I've spent time with Captain Ryan," she said carefully, watching her father's reaction. "I've seen how he leads, how he treats his people, and I've come to understand that the man you think he is not the man he really is." The king leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Zoreth, you know the importance of this union. It is not just for your happiness, it is for the survival of our people. If we do not secure this alliance with humanity, we risk everything. You have a duty." "I know my duty, father," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I also know that I cannot marry a man out of duty alone. I cannot marry someone I do not trust, and I cannot marry someone I do not believe in." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Captain Ryan is not the monster the stories make him out to be. He is a man, yes, but he is also more than that. He is trying to build a future, not just for his people, but for everyone." Her father's expression was unreadable, but she could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. He was not used to being questioned, especially not by her. "You are speaking of love," he said flatly, his voice hardening. "But love will not keep our kingdom safe. It will not defend us from the threat of the Thrak. You cannot afford to be sentimental about this. Your personal feelings have no place in the decisions of a ruler." Zoreth felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I am not speaking of love, father. I am speaking of trust. I cannot marry a man I do not trust, no matter what you say. If this union is truly for the survival of our people, then it must be based on something more than politics. It must be based on mutual respect, on understanding. Without that, what are we really fighting for?" The silence between them grew heavy, and Zoreth could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. Her father was a man of logic, a man who believed in the power of duty and responsibility. But she knew, deep down, that this moment was more than just a political decision. It was a choice about who she would become and what kind of leader she would be. Finally, the king spoke, his voice a low growl. "You are not a child anymore, Zoreth. You know what's at stake. I understand your doubts, but the choice is not yours to make alone. You will do your duty. You will marry Ryan. For the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of all our people." Zoreth felt her heart sink. She had known that her father would not easily accept her refusal, but hearing him say it so coldly, as if her own happiness didn't matter, left her feeling hollow. "But I don't want to marry him just for duty," Zoreth said softly, almost to herself. "I want to marry someone I believe in, someone who can lead with honor, not just with power. If I am to be a leader, I must follow my heart. I must choose a path that is true, even if it means defying you." Her father's eyes hardened, but there was something else in them now, a flicker of something that Zoreth couldn't quite place. "You think you can change the course of history with your heart?" he asked, his voice low. "You think you can just turn your back on your duty? The galaxy does not care for your feelings, Zoreth." Zoreth took a deep breath, feeling her chest tighten with a mixture of fear and determination. "Then I will find a way to make them care. If it is peace and strength that we seek, then I will find it, not through force, but through understanding." Captain Ryan and I may have different paths, but together we can create something greater than the fear and hatred that have divided our worlds." Her father looked at her long and hard, as if searching for any sign of weakness. But Zorith stood tall, her gaze unwavering. She was ready to face whatever consequences came with this decision. She had to be. For the first time, the king did not speak immediately. He simply looked at his daughter, his expression unreadable, as if contemplating the weight of her words. The silence stretched between them, and Zorith realized that this moment, this conversation, would be the turning point for both of them. No matter what happened next, she knew she had made her choice, and it was a choice that would change everything. A new beginning. The days following her confrontation with her father were some of the most intense Zorith had ever faced. The king's anger had simmered beneath the surface, and the pressure of her decision weighed on her shoulders with every passing hour. But as the days dragged on, Zorith found herself thinking less about the consequences of her actions and more about what the future could hold. Her heart, once torn between duty and desire, was now clear. She had made her choice, a choice that, for better or worse, would define not only her future but the future of her entire kingdom. But now, standing in front of Captain Ryan, Zorith knew that this moment wasn't just about political alliances. It wasn't just about duty. It was about two people choosing to stand together despite everything the world had told them was impossible. Ryan stood before her, his stance firm but relaxed, as if he had already made peace with the uncertain path ahead. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he held himself, something that told Zorith that he, too, had been waiting for this moment. The room was silent, filled only with the sounds of the hum of the base's air filtration system and the distant echoes of soldiers moving through the hallways. This was it, the moment where everything would change. "I've spoken to my father," Zorith said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had rehearsed these words 1,000 times, but now that they were here, they felt different. She was no longer just a princess delivering a message. She was a woman, making a choice for her own future. "I've told him that I cannot marry you just for the sake of peace. I will marry you because I believe in what we can create together. Because I trust you." Ryan's eyes softened as he took a step closer. For the first time, Zorith noticed the vulnerability in his gaze, the quiet relief that he had been waiting for her to say these words, to make this decision. "I never wanted to force you into anything, Zorith," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sincerity. "I've seen too many people pushed into choices that destroy them. I would never want that for you." Zorith nodded. "I know, but I also know that peace cannot be built by walking away from hard decisions. It can't be built by pretending that the past didn't happen. But it can be built by facing the future together, by finding a way to move forward, even with all the pain, all the scars we carry." Ryan reached out then, his hand hesitating for only a moment before gently resting on her shoulder. "We're both carrying a lot, aren't we?" His voice was quiet, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "But that doesn't mean we have to carry it alone. We can face it together." Zorith felt a spark of something deep within her, something that had been buried under layers of fear, duty, and uncertainty. For the first time since arriving here, she felt the weight of her decision not as a burden, but as a possibility, a chance for something greater than either of them had imagined. "You're right," she said, her voice softer now, as if the words were only just now coming to her. "We don't have to do this alone." Ryan's hand lingered for a moment, his touch warm and steady. "We don't," he agreed, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "And we won't. I've fought too many battles to let fear guide me now. I want to build something with you, a future. Not just for us, but for both of our people." Zorith's mind was still spinning, but she could feel something within her stirring. The beginning of hope, the possibility of a life she hadn't even dared to dream of. She had always been taught that a ruler's path was one of sacrifice, of giving up everything for the greater good. But here, in front of her, was a man who was asking for the same sacrifice. but with the promise of something more, a partnership, a shared vision, a future built on trust, not just duty. "I don't know what the future holds," Zorith said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still lingered in her chest. "But I know this, I can't lead alone, and I won't ask you to lead alone either." Ryan gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind of smile that spoke of understanding, of shared burdens. "Then we'll do it together. We'll make the future we want, even if it's difficult, even if it's not what anyone expects." Zorith felt the last of her doubts slip away, replaced by a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed. This wasn't just a marriage between two kingdoms. This wasn't just about survival. This was a partnership, a new beginning. And for the first time since her arrival, Zorith truly believed that they could make it work, that together they could heal the wounds of their past and build a future that was stronger, more unified, and more compassionate than either of their people had ever imagined. Later that evening, as Zorith stood with Ryan at the edge of the human base's landing pad, looking out at the stars that stretched endlessly above them, she realized that everything had changed. The future was no longer a distant dream. It was a reality, unfolding before her eyes. "We'll make it," Ryan said, his voice low, as though he too could feel the weight of the moment. Zorith nodded, her heart finally at peace. "Yes, we will." And for the first time, she truly believed it. Together, they would not only survive, they would thrive.